Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and right behind me you can see a couple bins. Those are the systems we're checking in on today. During our last check-in 12 days ago, these systems transitioned into their migration phase because the way I run most of my systems is that I do everyday worm composting in those systems until I get to the point where I know I want to get close to harvesting them, at which point I start withholding bedding, and that's what I refer to as foraging. And up until 12 days ago, these systems had been foraging for over 100 days, trying to work down residual bits of bedding remaining in the systems. And for the past 12 days now, these 306-day-old European nightcrawler bins have been migrating. And what you can see on the edge of the bins is what I refer to as the horizontal migration feeding zones, covered with the plastic bag back there. So basically we just shoved over the experimental object that's in these systems, which is a piece of fabric, a piece of wool fabric. Half of a wool sweater was placed into each of these systems, and to get the migration of these systems going, the wool fabric plus some food was placed over on the far end 12 days ago. And today I don't think we're going to be doing the haul out of the worms, but I am curious to see after 12 days how the depopulation of the castings is coming along, and I've got some more food to put into the horizontal migration feeding zone. So I'm going to get these systems up on the bench and we're going to get to work. So now if the cabbage and coffee that we started this migration with wasn't enough, hopefully this cucumber and watermelon and more coffee assortment will be enough to get the worms motivated to move out. But this will be our chance to examine how the finished castings are coming along as far as being depopulated. So really quick before we get started here, I guess we'll just uncover the horizontal migration feeding zones and get the plastic out of the way. And then we can get started. Something I do sometimes to try to further motivate the worms to exit their material is come in regularly to aerate the material that they occupy, in the hopes that it'll help the material dry and create an environment that's less hospitable for worms to want to stay in. That's something that I did not do here. Over the past 12 days, these systems have been untouched, so they're pretty much exactly the way we left them last time when we were in here together. And I am definitely curious to see how this wool fabric is progressing. The wool sweater appeared for quite some time to be making virtually no progress, almost making me feel like I should abandon the experiment and remove the wool sweater, but it was just a couple check-ins ago that we finally started noticing how the wool sweater was definitely showing significant signs of breakdown, which was a really big surprise for me. Since all that while, up until then, I had been getting the sense that the stuff was just sitting there idle, stagnating, going nowhere. And you know, before I get too into it, I figured let's finish sharing some of the stats about the system. I already mentioned some of the things, such as the interval since the last check-in, 12 days that we've been migrating, the 306 days of age. The wool fabric is 188 days in progress, and just as far as the composting and foraging phases go, those phases started out at 182 days, which is exactly 6 months, 26 weeks of regular composting, where we were adding bedding in addition to feedings. And then for the 112 days that followed that, the foraging phase was 16 weeks of continuing to feed but not adding any bedding. And now for the past 12 days, the migration, well, my first impression from just upending some of the material on the far end here was that it's pretty well populated with worms. And as far as the moisture content goes, it is pretty moist. You know, the last system that I migrated worms out of, the mixed red worm bin, I was pretty on it, to say the least. You know, every other day, every 2 days, I would come back in and I would aerate the material to try to help it further dry. And the entire while that the material was migrating, it was also getting blown on by a fan to help the material dry. So between aerations happening every other day and the fan blowing on the material nonstop, the material that the worms that had been occupying had a really good chance to dry off, motivating the worms to exit. And I don't even recall exactly how much time it took for that migration to get completed, but I don't think it was very long, perhaps 3 or so weeks. Whether or not we're going to be able to match that here, I don't know. I just didn't get the sense that the material in these systems was quite as damp and that running the fan or that regular aerations would really be necessary. I just figured leaving them uncovered and allowing the natural evaporation and drying process would be sufficient. And well, I don't know, I'm not even in all that much of a rush. I'm perfectly content if the migration takes, you know, another month or whatever. I mean, it'd be nice if it happened sooner. And who knows, maybe I'll just get a change of heart and maybe spend a little bit more time with these little guys and try to aerate their finished castings a few times to try to help it dry and to further motivate them to exit. But you can see that there's still lots and lots of worms in this material. But now that I've tilled it up and aerated it, who knows, maybe it'll aid in the drying and, you know, eventually motivate some worms to get moving to try to find themselves something that they prefer to be in more. Although I must say the moisture level is quite cozy if you ask me. I'm sure worms probably don't mind being in this stuff. So maybe it was really just a matter of me needing to come in here and sense what it felt like to kind of let the little light bulb in my head go off and say, hey, you know, maybe I should be coming back in here and aerating and helping the systems dry a little bit. Here, on the other hand, I must say, the material on the surface was quite dry. And as we blend it in, it'll help whatever's down low become even drier by being blended in. And then whatever's moist down low being surfaced will have access to evaporation and airflow. And I guess just my first sense from tilling up this material is that it does seem to be a little bit more sparsely populated than what we saw over in bin number 1. So whatever, it's not a race, it's all good. But it does seem to me like perhaps aerating bin number 1 would be beneficial. Bin number 2 here feels like it's a little bit drier, but still there's a good number of worms still hanging out in the material. But certainly not as many as what we saw in bin number 1. And I guess once this dry material that was out on the surface gets blended in, it's going to make this material a little bit less hospitable for the worms to want to stay in. Hopefully what we're doing here is going to serve as good motivation. Yeah, you know, so we're making our way closer to the horizontal migration feeding zone where the plastic was covering up the feeding zone, and it's the spot where we added the cabbage and coffee and the moisture was allowed to continue recirculating under the plastic. So as we get closer, it's not too surprising that there's worms showing up in greater numbers in this material as we get closer. And I guess something I kind of feel like I shouldn't be doing is upending material here and transporting worms from being close to the horizontal migration feeding zone to a spot further. So that seems a little counterproductive. I should be a little bit more careful and not do that. So we've done the aeration. I believe now we're ready to dig into the feeding zones, see how the sweater is coming along, how the wool fabric is progressing by becoming the primary bedding that makes up the horizontal migration feeding zone. And when we examine these feeding zones, you're going to notice a few differences from my typical horizontal migration feeding zone. My typical horizontal migration feeding zone is typically just prepared out of shredded paper cardboard, and it also usually has a little partition wall to help keep the lovely castings free of any sort of materials that were used to create the horizontal migration feeding zone. Here we didn't really bother to go to that extent. And you know, I can't remember if it was here in bin number 1 or if it was in bin number 2, but one of the chunks of wool was hardly able to hold together as a single piece. It still was a single piece, but there was this one little section where it was only like a couple threads appeared to be holding the two halves together. So here I do still sense that object is still one single object, or did we already lose a chunk of it here? So no, I guess it's official. We've already got a fragmented piece of wool sweater here. But I mean, it's amazing to see how this material is finally getting broken down after so long. So much time of it seeming to make virtually no progress. And you know, after 12 days, it's not too surprising that we're not really seeing any remnants of the cabbage that had been placed in here for these little guys to work on. So that's pretty cool. And you know, I think it's time to just proceed with, well, no, let's not feed yet, because we also want to see how the wool fabric over here in bin number 2 is progressing. Perhaps the fact that bin number 2 doesn't feel quite as damp, perhaps we're not going to see quite as much action on the wool sweater. But you know, it does seem to me like the wool sweater has a nice number of worms hanging out in it. I don't know, I feel like I'm being so rough with it, and then here too I could already see fragments of it coming separated from the main object. So I do believe that in time we're not going to be able to really keep that thing together anymore. Not that it's even together anymore, it's already clearly in multiple pieces. So why don't we just proceed? We're going to kind of set up the feeding zone the way we did last time by not adding any new bedding, basically allowing the fabric, the cotton, to serve as the sole material to be the bedding. Although, you know, the last time we put the food under the sweater and we used the sweater as the means for covering up the feeding zone, I think we're going to do that here as well. So yeah, why don't we get it done that way? We'll drop in a nice generous handful of cucumber and melon into each, a couple handfuls, and this stuff too. I believe if we were to come back after another 12 days, we're probably not going to find a whole lot of leftovers here either of this type of food. But I guess that is the whole idea, you know, when you're running a migration, you don't want to have all kinds of leftover food items. You're really kind of hoping that the worms are just going to kind of leave behind castings. And I suppose this little bit of coffee here can serve as a little bit of an odor barrier to keep the lovely scent of delicious foods down here in the feeding zone somewhat covered up, rather than having this nice delicious scent wafting out of here, potentially attracting pests. And you know, last time we had a couple pieces of coffee filter that we placed in here right beneath the feeding, but I think this time we're gonna use the coffee filters as sort of feeding zone indicators, which is just a little tradition I have down here. I'm always feeding coffee, and I've always got coffee filters, and the coffee filters have become my my traditional feeding zone indicators. So we'll just go ahead and plop the feeding zone indicators right on top as a further suppressant of delicious food odors, and hopefully it helps prevent any sort of pests from taking an interest in here. Luckily I don't see any flying insects or anything like that, but this year I've been pretty diligent about treating most of my systems, no, all of my systems I would say, with mosquito dunks to make sure there's very little chance of outbreaks of flying insects, and it seems to be working quite nicely so far. Wouldn't want to jinx it by getting my hopes up too high, but it does seem like we've managed to do pretty well in terms of flying insect control down here in my wormery this season. So here and there I just bump into a little fragment of leftover food scrap or whatever out here. And yeah, you know, even if I came back to aerate only bin number 1, it does seem like it might be beneficial, because this stuff is quite damp. The material in bin number 2 seems to be drying nicely, and it's a lot more crumbly. And it also seems like it's becoming depopulated quite nicely, but the worms seem really content hanging out in this stuff over here, and I'm wondering if perhaps I should incorporate a little extra time spent on these systems to try to help them dry a little bit and further motivate the worms to move out. So that's it for our check-in, everyone. On day 12 of the horizontal migration in these European nightcrawler worm bins, seems to be coming along pretty good, but it might take some time. It does seem like it's a kind of a slow process because the material we're starting with here is kind of damp, and I have been slacking off on helping it dry. Who knows, we could always invoke fan action to blow air across this to help drying. I could come in here regularly to aerate, but who knows, we'll just have to see how motivated I get. All right, everyone, that's for the check-in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.